Hello, this is WD.
FM, the official Walt Disney Family Museum podcast. We're your hosts, Brie Bertolacini, Marketing Manager.
And Chris Mullen, Senior Marketing and Communications Coordinator for the Walt Disney Family Museum.
Welcome back. Today we have a special two-part interview with 4 out of the 12 authors of Women of Walt Disney Imagineering: Peggie Farriss, Tori Atencio McCullough, Ellie Minsef Erlinson, and Kathy Rogers. We held an in-person program with them on October 29th, and since we were unable to have a program replay of their program, an interview with them is the next best thing. Founded by Walt under the name Walt Disney Enterprises, Inc., Walt Disney Imagineering was initially tasked with developing Disneyland, and since then has been responsible for designing and building Disney theme parks and attractions all over the world. 70 years after the founding of Walt Disney Imagineering, WDI, we are excited to highlight the contributions of women who made an indelible impact on some of WDI's most iconic and enduring projects.
A little bit about our first guests. Peggie Farriss began her 50-year career at Disney as an attractions hostess on the Storybook Land canal boats at Disneyland Park. She was instrumental in the research for Epcot's Spaceship Earth attraction and later became WDI's liaison to corporate sponsors. Her experience representing WDI's artistic vision led her to her final assignment as the creative development executive for Disneyland Paris, where for 5 years she led a team that doubled in size from 25 to 50. Kathy Rogers' career began in the Disneyland parking lot. She became an attractions lead and then was tapped to work for WDI at Disneyland in 1983. Working first as a coordinator, she rose through the ranks to the producer level, retiring as executive show producer with attractions as diverse as Muppet Vision 3D and Expedition Everest to her credit. Peggie, Kathy, thank you for joining us. We'll just get started right away. You both started working for Disney in the parks. As former parks employees ourselves, we find your paths to be very inspiring. Can you both talk about your paths working for the company and how it led you to Walt Disney Imagineering?
I guess I'll start because I started first. So right out of high school, I grew up in Anaheim, and I applied to UC Santa Barbara. Such a beautiful campus, a little far away, but not too far. And that summer, I received a rejection letter because I had taken a physiology class instead of Spanish 4. And it turns out, as great as the class was, it wasn't accredited. So a good friend of mine said, well, as long as you're going to be going to school locally, why don't you go down to Disneyland and see if they might have a job for you? She'd been working in the parking lot all summer. And she said, it's really fun, but tell them you'd like to be in operations. So I arrived at Disneyland, got an interview, and was assigned to work on Storybook Land. So I showed up for the attraction in my eyelet pinafore, and I loved it. And I was working Friday and Saturday nights, 8 to midnight. I made less than $2 an hour, and I just had, but I was really enjoying it. And then over time, the following year, I was working on the Matterhorn, and my foreman said, there's this program for Disneyland Ambassador. You might want to take a look at it. And I did, and it turned out that Disneyland was selecting one young single woman a year to represent the park and greet visiting dignitaries and visit children's hospitals. And I thought, well, that sounds really wonderful. So I applied, and I found myself among the 5 finalists. Now, I was not prepared for my interview with Card Walker, and he chose a very articulate, polished VIP hostess. But I thought, I made it to the finals with no preparation. So maybe if I really applied myself. So I took out a loan so I could enroll in a modeling school to learn all about descending stairs gracefully and getting in and out of a car, and never wear pearls whiter than your teeth. And I read the annual report backwards and forwards. I knew everything. And I ended up among the 5 finalists. And but I wasn't chosen. But still, I felt great about the fact that I'd given it my best shot, and I'd learned so much about the company in the process, and I'd met so many people. And I think that's the reason they selected me to be among 10 of the tour guides and ride operators, attraction hostesses, to travel to Florida in 1969 for the press conference. And I did, and we were accompanied by executives like Marty Sklar and Pete Clark and Jack Lindquist and Bill Evans, who was the director of the tree farm. And I was just blown away by the magnitude of the plans for Walt Disney World. And I thought, this is so phenomenal. I really want to be a part of it. So I came back to California. I graduated from Cal State Fullerton with a degree in English, and I found a position in Florida as part of the Walt Disney World Hotel Company. And I arrived in Florida 6 months before Walt Disney World opened. I was supervisor of guest activities, and we had responsibilities for childcare and guest information in the Polynesian and Contemporary Resorts hotels. There was the excitement of really seeing the project come up out of the Florida pine forests and swamps, and then here it all is, not only a magnificent Magic Kingdom, but two themed resort hotels connected by a monorail. It was amazing, and I spent the next 5.5 years in Florida. Through a series of reorganizations, I found myself planning meetings, and then one day I bumped into Marty Sklar, and I'd met Marty back in 1969 at the press conference. He'd really written our presentations, our narrations, the presentation to all the press and the executives and the Florida legislature. And we're catching up. And I said, Marty, I've been here 5.5 years. It's been so interesting. I've really learned so much, but I'm kind of interested in what might be available back in California, and I'm looking into those possibilities. And he said, well, Peggie, we're getting ready to plan Epcot, and I want to kick it off with a series of conferences on those future world topics. And you have experience in planning meetings, and you certainly know Walt Disney World, and you know Disney. So why don't you take that job? And I did. So 11 years after I first started on Storybook Land, I was working at Imagineering, and it was so amazing, so unlikely, but perfect.
That's amazing. So Kathy, tell us a little bit about your story.
I started in the parking lot at Disneyland. I was in college, and my dad had a job at Disney. He was at Disneyland. He was a food manager for the Blue Bayou. And so, it's like, go apply. So I went in and applied. I really didn't want to work, I wanted to have fun in school. But I went in, and I turned my application in, and they said, oh, I see you were recommended by John Rogers. I said, yes. And they said, oh, I see you're the daughter of John Rogers. I said, yes. So I got a job working out in the parking lot. I started in the parking lot. And then I had an opportunity that at the end of the summer, because I was casual. So I just worked on the holidays. And one of the friends of mine that I was working with wanted to go full time. So you have to go in and apply. And she goes, come with me. I want to go do this. And I said, okay, I'll go with you. So I applied too. I got the job. I got the permanent job. She didn't. So I started working through my college career. And after my college career, I realized that I could be making more money and have benefits at Disneyland and having fun than I could in my career, because my career was home economics, child and family development. So I could at some point become a director of a preschool, and I would still be making more money at Disneyland. So I became a full-time Disneyland employee. And in 1982, I just happened to be in Fantasyland, and we were building Tokyo Disneyland and Epcot. And the new Fantasyland it started out as a little rehab and became a project. So at that time, Walt Disney Imagineering was recruiting people from the parks to be project coordinators on their projects. So I became a 1-year loanee to Walt Disney Imagineering for the new Fantasyland at Disneyland. And so for 1 year, I was the project coordinator, which was really the gopher. In 1982, we had to take manual notes, type them up, send out all the meeting notes. I was taking notes for the electrical engineers, the mechanical engineers, the animation, stuff I didn't really understand about. So I was there for a year, and I came in February of 82, and our project was opening in May of 83. Well, at the end of 82, after Epcot was open, Imagineering laid off all of those employees from Epcot. And then in April, after Tokyo opened, all the employees, they downsized again from the Tokyo Disneyland. And at that time, I'm still going back to Disneyland because I was just an attraction hostess on loan. And then after we opened in May, I was hired by Imagineering to be the first SQS coordinator. That was when Wathel Rogers and Jack Taylor and the company decided that we have all of these parks now, that we needed to solidify, show quality standards at the park and across all of them. So I became the first SQS coordinator. And at that point, I became, an Imagineer.
Wow. Well, hearing both of your guys' stories from origins in the park, I know for Chris and I, we both started at the Disney College program, and just working in the parks, kind of that experience really, it does inform a lot, even though we're working at a museum. It's like something about it, that experience kind of still is with us. And I was wondering, from your experience in the park, how did that kind of influence kind of your work in the future, and like maybe compared to some of your colleagues who maybe didn't have that experience working in the parks?
For me personally, you know what, when I started in the 70s, early 70s, it was still magical to work at Disneyland, and to see the joy that I was part of the magic of somebody's day every day. My smile, my response, that was part of their whole day at Disney, and Disney brings that magic. So I always took that personally. And because I worked in the park, you understand how those attractions are perceived by the guest, and the interactions with the guest, and how things are laid out. So I took all of those personal experiences back with me to Imagineering, like how you lay out a queue, what's a hindrance for the guest, what's a hindrance for the ride operator. I took those, and so I used that a lot as I was a project coordinator, and then into a show producer, making sure that the story still fit how it was going to actually be operated and experienced by the guests.
And like Kathy, because I had 5 years as an attraction hostess, I really absorbed all those lessons, that everyone is a VIP. Treat everyone like they're a special guest. Mm-hmm. And when you do, you see how their faces light up. In those early days, in 1965 to 1971, when I was in the park, we took tickets. And so your first guest interaction was taking tickets, being able to read the name on a child's Mickey Mouse ears and surprising him by saying, "Well, Roger, how nice to see you," or "Happy birthday." And, people really were delighted. I also saw that how important it was for everyone to take responsibility for keeping the park clean. I used to see Dick Nunes, who was director of operations and ran a very tight ship. Dick picked up every popcorn box he encountered as he walked at a very fast clip through the park. And that sometimes when I was working Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln during the evening, it would be pretty quiet when all the guests were um, in the other lands of the park. We'd see them as people came in the morning, and we'd see them as people left, but it could be pretty quiet. So sometimes I would do rim light checks of Main Street, just taking note of every light that needed to be replaced. As the lead on Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, I would fill out reports to say the step light is out, the wall needs to be touched up. I personally would clean the display cases and straighten the strollers and collect the popcorn boxes. And, it really developed within me a sense of my personal opportunity and responsibility to deliver that magic. And it was so rewarding. And so 45 years later, when I found myself at Disneyland Paris, and I wanted to get to know the people on my team. There were about 30 Imagineers there when I first arrived. And in that group, there are more than a dozen different disciplines. But people become sort of siloed. The designers all know each other, the show technical people know each other. But I thought, you all have been working together for 20 years, but you don't necessarily know each other. So we did a little mix of, I would take 2 or 3 Imagineers from my team, randomly selected, to a restaurant in Disneyland Paris, in the Castle Park, or in the Disney Studio Park, or in the hotels. And we would experience it as a guest would experience it. And I think, Marty Sklar wrote those wonderful Mickey's 10 Commandments. And one of them is walk in your guest's shoes. And I think that also means experience the park as a guest would. And on the one hand, it's a delight to just be able to enjoy the experience that we all work so hard to create. But it also attunes you to, how could we make this better? And so, those things I think are really, truly foundational to our understanding of how to create experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so important to have that perspective too, that working in the parks gives you, that you really do get to see it from both angles, both from what the guest experiences, but then giving that experience, being the person on the other side that is facilitating that experience, understanding both what the guest is enjoying or not enjoying, but also what it's like to operate it and what it takes to operate it. All really important factors in creating any kind of experience, that actually having that experience in the park seems to really speak to and inform. So Peggy, you touched on it a little bit, your final assignment in Imagineering, being a creative development executive for Disneyland Paris. For those who might not know what that kind of role entails, could you go into a little detail about that?
Sure, of course. Well, Kathy mentioned earlier about the show quality teams being organized to reside at the parks around the world and to work closely with the operating partners. So when I arrived in Paris, I inherited a team of about 30 people, and I'd never led a team that large. So I thought, I'll just go and observe and be helpful as I might. But my first week there, Joe Schott, who was the chief operating officer, said, Peggy, you can't have a team with 30 people reporting to you. You need structure. And I thought, now I was an operator. I know the operating hierarchy, But Imagineering is more of a matrix organization. And for my team in Paris, we had more than a dozen different disciplines. We had architects and show set designers and graphic designers and illustrators and show writers for French and English. We had show technical people who focus on audio animatronics and projection and lighting, and material specialists. We had documentation responsibilities. We had show producers. We had coordinators. We had responsibility to communicate with human resources and finance and scheduling. And so, it's kind of like the blind men and the elephant. So the people on our team would interface with people throughout Disneyland Paris, maintenance and operations and food and safety and everything. But it was rare that anybody had an overarching understanding of who Imagineering and the show quality people are. Mm-hmm. So my job was, first of all, I had a responsibility to my team. And when Joe Schott said, you need an organization, I felt I need to understand what all of these people on my team do. And so I did kind of a speed dating where I interviewed everybody. And then an organization emerged for a design studio, a show technical group, and an administrative group. And as the creative executive, my job was to provide the managers of those departments with the resources that would enable them to make sure that the individuals on their team had the tools and training to do the best work they could do. So part of it was creating a management and a leadership environment that would support the people on the team. The other thing was, because my role back in California for the 23 years before I moved to Paris had been leading a team that integrated branding into parks around the world, I felt that as talented as the Disneyland Paris team was, they'd been kind of isolated for many, many years. And so I saw an opportunity to strengthen our relationship to Imagineering in Glendale, but also to encourage communications between our team and all the other show quality teams around the world, to say, we're all facing interesting challenges, but we're not the only people designing disclaimer signs or trash cans or trying to figure out how you organize a menu board when you're having to convey the items in 2 languages plus visuals. And so part of it was just making sure that my team had the resources. The other part of it was external communication. So I was in a position to be able to work with the senior leaders at Disneyland Paris to say, our designers can do a fantastic job designing a menu board for a new location, but we're all constrained by the amount of real estate we have on that menu board. And so can we find a way to agree on the number of items that are going to be represented on that menu board? And can we come to an agreement about the discipline that's required to edit that menu board thoughtfully, that you can't just keep throwing more items on. You can't have 9 dessert choices and 20 beverage choices and 16 entrees, and because there's just not enough room. So being in a position to champion things that I knew would translate into good design, that was an opportunity for me.
That sounds so. I love kind of the combining of kind of the overall kind of teamwork and collaboration that was involved. I really loved hearing you talk about that. Now, Kathy, can you kind of mentioned how you got to become a show producer? Can you explain to our audience what the role of an executive show producer is?
I find it very interesting. So, because Peggy and I have very similar paths. I mean, in terms of how I perceived my role as a show producer. Um, Ultimately, my role was being the creative lead, the lead of the creative team. But because my background came from the park and as a project coordinator, and as the project coordinator, I went across the every discipline. I needed to know what the mechanical engineers needed, what the ride engineers needed, what the architects were doing, what the civil engineers were doing, what the show designers were doing, what the colorists were doing, what the writer was writing. Was it going to? So I had an understanding of all of those disciplines. So when I became a show producer, what I felt my role was is to understand what everybody needed to do. Ultimately, the creative is driving the story and what's going to be built and put in the park. But ultimately, with that comes budget, comes schedule, comes executive reviews. So my role was to make sure that everybody was communicating, that we understood the impacts that everybody had with each other, because it's a somebody just doesn't bring a piece to the game and walk away. It gets mixed in. So how the special effects were going to affect the architecture or the structure, everybody. So I felt my role was sort of the communicator, making sure everybody understood what was happening, what the impacts were going to be, and then what was the best solution for us to tell that story within the budget, the schedule, the executive reviews, and the creative intent. So that was sort of my role as a show producer. I didn't make any of the creative decisions, but I made sure that the decisions that were being made were the best decisions for us as we moved forward in bringing that magic to the parks.
It makes
That makes
so
sense.
much sense. I mean, there are so many different interests that are involved, a lot of people that are bringing something different to the table. And I mean, if we go from kind of the overall structure of the role to maybe down to a project base, talking about some of the more popular projects, well-known projects that you both have been involved in. Peggy, we can start with you. For many of us, Spaceship Earth is our favorite part of Epcot. And you were part of doing the historical research for that attraction. How did you and your team go about narrowing down thousands of years of history to depict human innovation?
Well, first of all, Ray Bradbury had been working with Imagineering, and he'd given us a story outline that began with Cro-Magnons hunting the woolly mammoth and then recounting that story in a cave with a shaman and paintings on the walls of the cave. So we had a general chronology of how we go from oral to pictures to pictographs like hieroglyphics through to the network of roads, and then the Gutenberg Bible, the printing press, and then this explosion of technology that would enable us to send people out into space and be able to communicate with them over distances. So we had that general outline, but then I worked with a graduate student from USC's Annenberg School of Communications, and she and I filled a conference room with 3x5 cards, and we documented the key developments in communications because that was the initial story for Spaceship Earth. And then we also amplified that by looking at what was going on in culture, in arts, in other technologies, in human exploration. So we had a room that basically provided us with a framework. At the same time, there were artists and model makers who were defining what a scene would look like. But it was my job to figure out, when in Egypt do we have hieroglyphics that you'd find on the walls of the temples, as well as hieratic writing, where a scribe is writing on papyrus, and essentially taking dictation from a pharaoh who is dictating a letter. And we found I did a lot of research, and I was inspired by my brother, who was 5 years old when I was in college, and he loved trains. And he'd come home from the children's library with armloads of picture books on trains, and he'd spread them out on the living room floor, and he would study them. And then he would persuade my mom to take him to the railroad crossing, and he would watch all the trains go by. Now, that was not the research method I had used in college. I've been happy to find a good source and that I pursue it. But he looked at many sources. And so I adopted that method when I was doing the historical research. And I would just read as much as I could. We were blessed to have a fabulous research library at Imagineering. Yeah. And they could find anything. One day, my boss, Pat Scanlon, came back from a creative review. They'd been looking at one of the sets for the set for the Roman scene. And Pat came back and he said, John Hench says we need something from the 12 tables of Roman law, well, which I'd never heard of. I talked to the library. They sent away to UCLA's law library. And back the next day came a little book, The 12 Tables of Roman Law, in Latin. I found a piece that would fit the wall that we wanted to embellish. And then I thought, guests of ours will read Latin. I know some of them will, so I better know what it says. And it said, if you are summoned to appear in court, you must appear. If you cannot provide transportation, it will be provided for you, but the cart need not be covered in pillows. A travel policy from ancient Rome. So, I was just so excited about being able to spend a couple of years really diving into the details and reaching out to experts around the country to give us ancient Phoenician and we found the patent model for the printing press that you encounter as you travel through the scene into the Industrial Revolution. We found graffiti from the walls of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And, it was just an iterative process of saying, okay, here's the communications message. Now, how do we anchor that in the details, and to be able to find the Huntington Library has a Gutenberg Bible, and they let us make a reproduction of one of the pages. It's in the attraction. We found people to play ancient instruments from the Renaissance. I mean, it was such a delightful assignment. And luckily, I kept good notes. I had 18 pages of bibliography to document it. And then for the next 20 years, Marty Sklar had me answer every guest letter that had a question about Spaceship Earth.
Wow. Well, those guests, I mean, they can not only thank the Phoenicians, but they can also thank Peggie Farriss for helping them with those questions.
Well, and I guess to change speeds from one attraction to another, Kathy, you worked on Expedition Everest at Bree's old home park, Disney's Animal Kingdom. And for that particular attraction, what are the challenges that you faced in telling a story via a thrilling roller coaster? And What, on the other hand, what were opportunities that that method allowed as opposed to a much slower paced attraction like Spaceship Earth?
I think, and all my experiences, I think Expedition Everest was probably one of the most fun and collaborative projects that I ever worked on. So it really sort of, we had all the necessary people at the very beginning, the ride engineers, the writers, the designers, the storytellers. So every day we would, start, here's the story thread. And then we knew that for Animal Kingdom, what we wanted to do was bring a really exciting attraction, a coaster. But at the same time, it doesn't want to, a coaster, roller coaster doesn't live at Animal Kingdom. A tea train could. So it was setting up that story and then allowing the story to tell, how you go up through the temple, you hit an unexpected experience. So what can I do with a roller coaster? What can a coaster do? What are the things that I can do that will bring a thrill to the guest? We can stop, we can go backwards. That was a big that was a big deal for us at that time. So, working with Joe Rohde and the ride engineers, the storytellers, the rockwork designers, we were there everybody every day working together, making that the very best it could be with the tools that we had. So that was really fun because it is an intensive guest experience. And it was so much fun because the story, I think we hit all the fun story parts, having the Yeti, creating the Yeti. We actually had a design contest with throughout the design teams, animation, feature animation, TV animation, and WDI. They all sent in, their creations of what the Yeti would look like, and we selected one, and that's what we built. So, and it was really funny. What's kind of funny is when you go through the queue line at Expedition Everest, there's a lot of story that's also put in that. And as Peggie was saying, they had, cards. They had a conference room filled with cards. We had a conference room. Every wall of the queue line had its own board, and it had a story. Here's the story we want to tell. We want to tell about the culture. We want to tell about the animals. So every wall had the storyline, what we wanted to tell, and then all the things what we could do to do that. And then we sort of weeded out what's the best way to tell that story. But we had a conference room for a year, and every wall of the queue line had its own board, and we reiterated and iterated through it to make it the best it could be.
That's like one attraction that I really loved going through the queue. I think throughout Animal Kingdom, I think the queues are really rich with story. I worked on Kilimanjaro safaris, and just like spending time in that queue, I was like, okay, you really feel like what the entire, even just that area of the land, they're so rich with the stories of the animals and the culture. And to be honest, that Yeti, I remember seeing it for the first time and pure terror. I was like, oh no, like I don't usually feel that way in Disney attractions. So that's pretty good.
That is a very intense attraction. And I will say that, we would do a lot of test rides to make sure that the animation was working, but we could only do like 3 times, and then everybody would step off and you'd get your stomach back, and then you would do it again. But but that was a great team, the architects, the designers, the ride engineers. It is a really good, and at the end of the day, when we talked about, even when I was working at the park, to see the smile on people's face and to see the experience, that was like one of those attractions that, that you did well. And that was what, 2005, 2006 when that opened, and it's still as good today as it was when we opened it. So that's part of, being part of that legacy is very fun.
Yeah, both two very amazing attractions that people are still love to talk about today, Spaceship Earth and Expedition Everest. So definitely a wonderful legacy leaving that behind. I wanted to quickly talk a little bit about the book project, Women of Walt Disney's Imagineering, that you both spoke at the Walt Disney Family Museum. How did you both get involved in participating in that book?
Ellie Erlitzen, this was her little baby. She has an extraordinary story, and she's like one of the first concept architects, female concept architects at Imagineering, and she's very good, and she mentored a lot of the architects coming through the Imagineering, and she they kept telling her, you should tell your story. So she thought, okay, I'm going to write a book. And then as she started to do that, she realized that it wouldn't be as full as it could possibly be. And I have the privilege of Ellie and I ski together every year. We're going to ski until we're 80. We've got a few more years. So she said, would you be interested if I did this project? Would you be interested in participating? And I said, of course. So I was very willing to be able to, I didn't think I had to have much to contribute, not like so many of the women, and but it was very fun to be able to tell our story, and to I think that when we started it, the intent was to self-publish it on Amazon Publishing, and then give it to our families as part of our personal legacies at Disney. So it was a great thrill and an honor to have Disney publish it and help us.
I was back from Paris in 2015, in the fall of 2015. I was looking forward to my 50th anniversary with the Walt Disney Company, and 40 of those years being at Imagineering, and with no idea of what I would do after I stopped driving from Newport Beach to Glendale every day. It's like, well, that would give me three hours or 4 hours a day to figure out. And Ellie approached me and told me about the project she'd been putting together and invited me to participate. And like Kathy, I thought, well, I don't know whether my story, I hadn't really thought about what my story was. But it was really wonderful to be able to sit down with these 11 other amazing women. And because my role had been, I hadn't really been, until I went to Paris, I hadn't really been part of a large team. I hadn't really, my work on Spaceship Earth was pretty solitary. And then I would offer up what I had found to the artists and designers. But I wasn't part of project team meetings or anything. So being able to, even though I knew these women, passing them in the hall, I'd worked with Lynn Macer. I'd worked in Lynn's department in research and planning, but I knew people, Kathy and Karen Armitage and others, but I hadn't really heard their stories. And so one of the real delights was just sitting down. There was one get together where we'd written our stories and we read them to each other. And that was amazing. And it isn't until you hear what each of these women went through, particularly women who had academic and professional training in fields that, and hearing about the obstacles that they'd encountered, or in Ellie's case, the idiots they encountered. And you think, oh, my story isn't so unique. There's a theme here. But really being able to be part of this process was really a joy. And now that we're having the opportunity to meet aspiring Imagineers, whether they're 6 years old or 16 years old or 26, and it's really great to talk to kids who are in the process of finding their way, and then hearing from others who can say, oh yes, you know, in my field, I encountered similar
Yep.
challenges. So it was really funny. But I think we also came to an understanding of there being certain qualities and reserves that we developed, techniques we developed to find our way in fields that maybe weren't all that welcoming or ready for us. And that's interesting too.
Well, and something that I think is so cool that you both touched on about telling your story in Imagineering is that it's not really just your story. It's a story of all the connections that you've made, the people that you've worked with, the people that you've been mentored by, and also the people that you've helped along the way as well. So that it's all about those connections, and to kind of speak to those connections. For both of you, what would you say would have been the best advice that you were given by someone in a mentoring capacity, and what would then you want to pass along to other young women who are interested in a role in Imagineering?
Well, I don't know about you, Kathy, but I had no mentors. There were no mentors, but
Yeah.
but there were, you know, but I was able to observe people and learn from them. So I learned from Dick Nunes that there's a dedication to every aspect of the Disneyland experience. None of us is too senior to pick up a box of popcorn. All of us have a responsibility for being reliable and responsible team players. And, you know, whether that means you come back from your break on time or you show up in a clean costume, you smile and engage with guests, you're somebody that your fellow cast members can rely on in those unexpected circumstances. And from Jim Cora, I learned that paying attention to all the details, getting those strollers straight, and having an attraction that looks as good as it possibly can, that was important. Bob Allen was such I was so impressed that Bob Allen paid attention to everyone. He was as kind and attentive to the server who brought him his meal as he was to an executive or a statesman that he was showing around Walt Disney World, or a world leader. You know, he truly treated everyone like a VIP. He was kind, he was respectful. And then I had the amazing opportunity to work with Marty Sklar, and Marty was, I mean, a work ethic beyond belief, attention to every detail, and a sense of fun. You know, Marty had a great sense of humor, and he just made working fun. And so when I encourage people, I say, dream big, work hard, have fun. And I would also add, just be a team player. You know, nobody does this by themselves, and, you know, works well with others. You know, maybe that was on your kindergarten report card, but, you know, being able to be there for your team and to dig deeply, you know, do the best you can with what you have, and then go beyond that.
So Peggy, I have to, this is really funny now, because you keep talking about how, you know, Dick Nunes would pick up the popcorn, you know, package. I have so many of my friends, when we go into restrooms or restaurants, I bend down and I pick up the towels and throw them away, and they go, "What are you doing?" Well, I don't know. So now I know where I got that, right? Is at the park, you always, you do the little things, and it makes a big difference. And it's true. I don't think I had a mentor, but at Imagineering, what's interesting when we talk about the matrix, the organization of Imagineering, anybody was accessible to you. You did not, it was not like at the parks, there's the hierarchy, right? You have to start down here and then you can slowly get up to the top. I could go in and talk to Marty Sklar, hey, Marty. And he's the president of the company. So it was across the board. And so I think what I learned is that I could ask anybody any question. If I didn't understand something, everybody, all the designers, whether animation or mechanical or architectural, they would take the time to explain their process and what needed to be done, or why they were doing something a certain way. So I guess everybody at Imagineering mentored me. And I think the one thing I did learn sort of from experience is that there's more than one answer. There's more than one solution to any issue or any opportunity. I always used to like to say, okay, what opportunities do we have? Here are the things we know are sort of fixed, and what opportunities do we have to make it as good as it can be? So I think that's sort of my mentoring thing, was just, understand that it's just not one, answer, not one solution. There are multiple ways of getting a job done. I think, if I wanted to, my suggestion to, future Imagineers is that, don't be afraid to go through doors that you had never anticipated opening for you. Be willing to try things that you would never have thought that you would want to try. I was a project coordinator. I was happy being, the gopher, running around, getting drawings, lugging stuff around. And then the opportunity came to be show quality standards, and then a show producer. And those are sort of steps that I didn't start at Disney thinking I'm going to be a show producer when I, in my career. I was actually happy being, on Storybook Land and Matterhorn. I worked on Storybook Land and Matterhorn, Country Bear Jamboree. I was happy because I was getting fulfillment watching the guests respond. And then in my career at Imagineering, the satisfaction that I get and continue to get on the attractions that I worked with, and seeing the joy that it brings our guests. I think it's just don't be afraid to fail. There's success in failing. You learn things and you just keep going forward.
I think that's really important, Kathy. And, in my own story, mine starts with a rejection letter. And then it starts with actually 3 failed attempts to become Disneyland ambassador, and reorganization in Florida that changed me, changed my role from supervisor of guest activities to coordinator of conventions. And, if you let those rejections and failures define you, then you miss out on all the things that you learned in the process. And if you know that you did the best you could, then it's surprising to see what other things open up for you. And like you, I love that idea of embracing the unknown and being uncomfortable with something you don't know about. Being the constant learner is such a it's great to feel comfortable with the uncomfortable and the unknown. And if you can embrace that, it's you have no idea what lies around the corner.
I love this advice so much, and I think it can be applied in so many wonderful ways. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I definitely have applied it to, I can see it in my own journey, even though it's, it's not in Walt Disney Imagineering. So I appreciate both of your time today. And thank you so much for joining us on our podcast and participating in a talk at the Walt Disney Family Museum. So thank you so much.
Thank you
so
so very much.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thank you.
That was such a fun conversation. Not many of the guest speakers we host at the museum, like you and I, Brie, have had formative experiences working frontline in the Disney parks.
That was such a fun conversation. You can read more of their stories and the other 8 incredible women's stories in their book, Women of Walt Disney Imagineering. You can purchase their book wherever books are sold. Tune in next week for the second part of this interview with Tori Atencio McCullough and Ellie Minsef Erlandson.
Thanks for tuning in to WDFM, the official Walt Disney Family Museum podcast. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Email us questions or comments at podcast@wdfmuseum.org.
Learn more about our upcoming programs, workshops, and classes by subscribing to our e-newsletter on our website, waltdisney.org, or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at WDF Museum.
Keep Imagineering and keep moving forward.
Bye.
Bye.